There is a specific, well-documented window at the beginning of a new relationship where two people cannot stop thinking about each other, where flaws look charming, arguments feel impossible, and the future feels certain. And there is an equally well-documented pattern that follows it. Within a few years, sometimes sooner, that feeling fades, replaced by routine, irritation, and the quiet sense that something real was lost. Most people explain this the same way. They fell out of love. The spark ran its course. That is simply what happens. Bruce Lipton, a cell biologist who spent years studying how individual cells respond to their environment before turning his attention to human relationships, argues this explanation is wrong, and wrong in a specific, correctable way. The honeymoon period does not fade because love itself is temporary. It fades because two conflicting programs are running inside each partner at the same time, one built for connection and one built for protection. And once the protective program takes over, the biology that made the honeymoon feel effortless simply switches off. Lipton's larger argument draws directly from his background studying the biology of individual cells, work he built his earlier career on before turning to relationships specifically. His claim is that the same principles governing how a single cell decides whether to grow or defend itself apply, almost without modification, to how two people in a relationship either continue falling in love or slowly stop. In this video, I want to walk through the actual argument step by step, the biology he leans on, the specific mechanism he says causes the honeymoon period to end, and what he proposes as the way to consciously rebuild it. I also want to be honest about where his broader body of work draws real scientific pushback, because that context matters for how much weight to put on some of his more sweeping claims. Stay with me. The chemistry of new love. Lipton opens with the biology of the honeymoon period itself, describing it as a genuinely real, measurable neurochemical state rather than a vague feeling. Early romantic attraction floods the brain with dopamine, driving focus and craving toward the other person almost like a mild addiction. Oxytocin builds a sense of trust and bonding with physical closeness. Serotonin shifts in ways that overlap with patterns seen in obsessive thinking, which is part of why a new partner can be genuinely difficult to stop thinking about. The specific point Lipton wants to establish is that none of this is imagined or exaggerated. The euphoria of new love has a real chemical signature, and it is genuinely different from the calmer, steadier bond that follows once a relationship matures. His argument is not that this early chemistry should last forever unchanged. It is that most people assume its natural fading is the whole story, when in fact something separate and correctable is usually happening underneath it, and that separate thing is what actually kills the connection, rather than the simple passage of time. He is careful to note that some softening of this initial chemical intensity is normal and even healthy, since a relationship permanently running at honeymoon-level neurochemical arousal would be exhausting to sustain and difficult to build an actual life around. The problem he is describing is not the natural settling of early intensity into something calmer. It is the specific, sharper decline into distance, irritation, and disconnection that many couples experience instead, which he argues is a different phenomenon entirely, driven by a separate mechanism rather than simply chemistry running its natural course. Growth or protection. This is the central biological principle Lipton borrows most directly from his work on individual cells, and the one the rest of the book builds on. He describes a basic switch present in the cell membrane, an inability to be in growth mode and protection mode simultaneously. A cell reaching out toward nutrients, dividing and building is not, at that same moment, mounting a defensive response to a perceived threat. The two functions draw on the same limited resources, and the cell's environment determines, moment to moment, which one is switched on. Lipton argues the same switch operates in relationships, at the level of the whole person. When a partner feels safe, understood, and unthreatened. The biological state associated with growth, openness, and connection is active, and behavior in that state tends to look generous, curious, and warm, the same qualities that define the honeymoon period. When a partner feels criticized, dismissed, or under threat, even subtly, the same biological switch flips toward protection, and behavior in that state tends to look defensive, withdrawn, or combative, regardless of how much the person still consciously wants the relationship to work. The specific insight is that this switch operates largely outside conscious control. A person does not decide to become defensive. Their nervous system registers a perceived threat and reallocates resources accordingly, and no amount of consciously wanting to feel loving overrides that reallocation once it has already begun. This is, in Lipton's telling, the actual mechanism behind most recurring relationship conflict. Not a lack of love, but a nervous system repeatedly tipping into protection mode faster than either partner notices it happening. He extends the metaphor a step further, arguing that a relationship itself can be thought of almost as a shared organism, with each partner's nervous system responding not only to their own internal state, but to subtle cues from the other person's state as well. A partner who walks in already tense, even without saying anything, can trigger the other partner's protective mode simply through tone, posture, or facial expression, well before either person has consciously registered what is happening or said a single word about it. The subconscious program. Lipton extends this into what he considers the deeper cause. He argues that the vast majority of daily behavior, well over 90% by his estimate, runs on subconscious programming rather than conscious choice, and that this programming is installed overwhelmingly in early childhood, largely by observing how the adults around us handled closeness, conflict, and love. The specific mechanism he describes is that a young child's brain operates for several years primarily in a state that absorbs information, the way a recording device absorbs sound, without much of the filtering or critical evaluation an adult brain applies. Whatever pattern of intimacy a child witnessed repeatedly, whether that meant warmth and repair after conflict, or coldness and withdrawal, becomes installed as the default template for what closeness is supposed to look like, running quietly in the background for the rest of that person's life, regardless of what they consciously believe about how they want their own relationships to go. This creates the specific tension Lipton treats as the real source of the honeymoon period's decline. A person can consciously, sincerely want deep, lasting intimacy, while carrying a subconscious template installed decades earlier that treats sustained closeness itself as unfamiliar or even unsafe. As a relationship deepens past the initial chemical rush, this older template increasingly takes over, quietly steering behavior toward whatever pattern of connection or distance was modeled in childhood, often without either partner recognizing what is actually driving the shift. Lipton is specific about why this is so easy to miss. Because the pattern was installed before conscious memory typically forms, most people have no explicit recollection of learning it at all. It simply feels like their personality, or like an accurate read of how relationships naturally work, rather than what it actually is. A specific, learned template absorbed from one particular household, decades earlier, under conditions that may have nothing to do with the relationship currently being lived in. Perception over genetics. Lipton connects this back to the broader argument he is best known for, drawn from his research on epigenetics, the study of how environmental signals influence gene activity without changing the underlying genetic code itself. His central claim, applied here to relationships, is that perception, not fixed biological destiny, is what determines behavior. A cell's environment tells its genes what to express. A person's perceived environment, including how safe or threatened a relationship currently feels, tells their nervous system which mode, growth, or protection to run. The specific implication he draws is a hopeful one, and it is the hinge his entire practical argument rests on. If the pattern degrading a relationship were fixed and unchangeable biological destiny in the strictest sense, there would be little to do about it. But if the pattern is instead a learned, subconscious response to perceived threat, shaped originally by childhood modeling, then it is, in principle, capable of being noticed, interrupted, and retrained, the same way any other learned pattern can be, given the right conditions and enough repetition. Rebuilding the honeymoon state. Lipton's practical argument follows directly from this. If the decline of a relationship is driven largely by an old, subconscious threat response, repeatedly overriding a couple's conscious desire for closeness, then rebuilding the honeymoon feeling requires addressing the subconscious pattern directly, rather than simply trying harder consciously, which he argues rarely works on its own, because the conscious mind is not actually where the sabotaging pattern lives. His specific recommendations center on creating conditions of genuine safety before attempting to resolve conflict, since a nervous system already in protection mode is not capable of the openness a real repair conversation requires. He also emphasizes becoming aware of the specific triggers, often surprisingly minor and traceable back to childhood patterns, that flip a partner from growth mode into protection mode, arguing that simply naming and recognizing these triggers together as a couple measurably reduces their power over time. He is specific that this is not a one-time fix. Because the subconscious pattern was installed over years, he argues it typically requires sustained, deliberate practice to retrain, whether through structured communication techniques, various forms of subconscious reprogramming work he discusses elsewhere in his broader writing, or simply consistent, repeated experiences of safety that slowly overwrite the older template with a new one. Now let us be honest about this book, and about Lipton's broader body of work. Lipton's earlier career, including real research as a cell biologist, gives the biological framing in this book genuine surface credibility, and the growth versus protection switch he describes at the cellular level is grounded in legitimate, established cell biology. The application of that principle to relationships and childhood subconscious programming, however, is where the book moves from established science into considerably more speculative territory, and this is a distinction worth holding onto rather than blurring together. Lipton is, more broadly, a controversial figure within mainstream biology. His earlier and better-known book on the biology of belief has drawn sustained, substantive criticism from working biologists and geneticists, who argue that he significantly overstates, and in places, misrepresents what epigenetics research actually demonstrates, extending legitimate findings about environmental influence on gene expression into much larger claims about consciousness, belief, and healing that the underlying research does not support. His writing elsewhere also draws on frameworks like quantum consciousness and law of attraction language that sit outside accepted science entirely, and readers encountering this book without that context may reasonably assume a stronger scientific foundation than actually exists beneath some of the more expansive claims. The specific claims in this particular book about childhood programming and the growth protection switch in relationships are also, it is worth noting, argued primarily through analogy and personal narrative, including extensively from Lipton's own late-in-life marriage, rather than through controlled research specifically testing these mechanisms in couples. The underlying psychological observations, that early attachment patterns shape adult relationship behavior, and that felt safety versus felt threat strongly influences how open or defensive a person becomes, are genuinely well supported by decades of attachment research conducted independently of Lipton's work. The specific cellular framing he layers on top, while vivid and memorable, is best understood as an illustrative metaphor rather than a literal, proven mechanism connecting cell membranes to marital conflict. None of this means the practical advice is worthless. Creating safety before attempting repair, recognizing old triggers, and treating recurring conflict as a pattern to interrupt rather than a verdict on the relationship are all reasonable, broadly supported ideas. It means the confident scientific packaging around them deserves more skepticism than the book itself tends to invite. So what do you actually take from this? The most useful idea, stripped of its more speculative framing, is recognizing the difference between a partner who has stopped caring and a partner whose nervous system has slipped into a defensive pattern neither of you fully chose. Recurring conflict is frequently not a verdict on how much two people love each other. It is often a signal that something in the interaction keeps triggering an old protective response, worth identifying specifically rather than treated as unexplainable bad luck. The second useful idea is that safety has to come before repair, not the other way around. Attempting to resolve a real disagreement while either partner still feels criticized or under threat tends to fail, not because the argument itself is unresolvable, but because the nervous system in a defensive state is simply not available for the kind of openness real repair requires. This has a practical implication many couples never act on. Waiting until a conflict is fully underway to try to fix the underlying dynamic is usually too late, since both nervous systems are already in protection mode by that point. The more effective moment to address the pattern is earlier, calmer, and deliberately separate from the heat of an actual disagreement, when both people are still in a state capable of genuine reflection rather than defense. The third thing is simply this. The intensity of a honeymoon period was never proof that a relationship is destined to fade into routine. It was a temporary chemical state, real while it lasted, that can be replaced, not by chasing the same chemistry indefinitely, but by consciously building the specific conditions of safety and understanding that allow genuine closeness to keep renewing itself, long after the original rush of new love has settled into something steadier. Thanks for watching all the way through. What fades is rarely the love itself. It is usually just the safety underneath it, quietly slipping away before anyone noticed it was the thing holding everything else up.